Picture yourself in the flickering candlelight of a 17th century Spanish palace. The air is thick with incense, the walls draped in heavy velvet, and the courtiers around you whisper in tones so low they seem to slither through the shadows. Their eyes aren't on the glittering chandeliers or the gold-embossed tapestries. They're fixed on the throne, where a figure slumps, his face a mask of deformity so startling it feels like a violation of nature itself. This is no ordinary king. This is Charles II of Spain, a man his own people called El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. They believed he was cursed, that his twisted body and faltering mind were the work of the devil himself. But let me draw you closer. Let me share a secret. Charles wasn't cursed by demons. He was cursed by something far more sinister, his own bloodline. This is the story of a dynasty that devoured itself from within, a tale of power, obsession, and a human cost, so horrific it makes the wildest fiction seem tame. So settle in, because we're about to unravel a history darker than any ghost story. The Habsburgs were the titans of Europe, their empire sprawling from the sun-soaked shores of Spain to the misty valleys of Austria. Their wealth was unmatched, their influence a shadow over every court. But power breeds fear, and the Habsburgs were terrified of losing theirs. Their solution was chilling in its simplicity: keep the bloodline pure. To them, purity meant control, and control meant marrying within the family. Cousins wed cousins, uncles took nieces as brides, and sometimes the family tree knotted into tangles so tight it was impossible to unravel. This wasn't a whim, it was a strategy, a way to lock their wealth and titles within their grasp. But what they couldn't see, what no one in their time could fully understand, was that they were waging war on nature itself. Now let's step into 1661, the year Charles II was born. The Spanish court was electric with hope. This was the heir to the throne, the future of the Habsburg dynasty. But when the midwives saw the newborn prince, their hands trembled. His head was too large, his jaw unnaturally prominent, his body frail and quivering. Whispers spread like sparks. This child was wrong. Some said he was cursed at birth, others that his mother, Queen Mariana, had been bewitched by rivals. The truth was less mystical, but far more damning. Charles' parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents? Also uncle and niece. Trace his lineage back, and you'd find a family tree less like a tree and more like a spider's web, with strands looping back on themselves in defiance of reason. His genetic makeup was so inbred that he had the diversity of a castaway marooned for centuries. As Charles grew, or rather, struggled to grow, the court's dread deepened. Most children take their first steps by their first birthday. Charles couldn't walk until he was 8. His speech was a garbled mess, words slurred and wet, nearly impossible to decipher. His jaw, that infamous Habsburg jaw, jutted so far forward that his lips couldn't meet, leaving his mouth perpetually open, saliva pooling at his chin. Eating was a torment. Palace kitchens churned out pureed mush, like food for an infant, because anything solid would simply fall out. Imagine the shame. A king, ruler of an empire that spanned oceans, reduced to a drooling spectacle at every meal. His mind was as fragile as his body. Charles couldn't read until he was 10, and even then, his tutors despaired. They described teaching him as pouring water into a shattered cup. Nothing held. His emotions were a storm, swinging from violent tantrums to eerie silences, where he'd stare into nothingness for hours. Courtiers, eager to please, wrote glowing letters about his progress, but private diaries told a different story. This was no kingly mind. This was a child trapped in a decaying body, a ruler who could barely govern himself. Yet the Habsburgs pressed on. They knew their marriages were producing weaker, stranger children with each generation. Charles' siblings, many of whom died young, were frail and odd, but power was worth the cost. Diluting the bloodline with outsiders was unthinkable. Better a deformed king than a weakened dynasty. So, they married closer and closer until Charles became the living proof of their folly. His spine was so curved, he seemed to carry an invisible burden. His limbs so thin they looked ready to snap, his head so large it wobbled on a neck too weak to hold it. At 35, he resembled a sick child stretched into a grotesque parody of adulthood. The court tried to hide the truth. Official portraits painted a regal figure with a strong jaw and piercing eyes. But no brush could mask reality when Charles appeared in person. Foreign ambassadors, used to the splendor of European courts, struggled to hide their shock. One French diplomat wrote, "He is more pitiable than monstrous, a man whose existence seems to defy God's plan." The whispers grew louder. This wasn't natural. This was a curse, a punishment for some unspeakable sin. Priests nodded, nobles crossed themselves, and the common folk spun tales of witchcraft and demonic pacts. Charles, the most powerful man in Europe, became a living legend of horror. But let's linger on Charles himself. Imagine waking each day in a body that betrays you, surrounded by people who fear you, pity you, or use you for their schemes. Imagine being a king, yet treated like a child, your every failure magnified. Charles wasn't just a ruler, he was a prisoner of his blood, his throne, his era. His body wasn't just deformed, it was a rebellion against nature, a puzzle of failures that seemed to defy human survival. And yet, he endured, stumbling through a life that was as much a medical enigma as it was a political catastrophe. At 35, Charles stood barely 5 feet tall, but his proportions were so wrong he seemed even smaller. His head, massive and misshapen, dwarfed his hunched torso, which looked crushed by an unseen force. His limbs were skeletal, his fingers trembling, his legs buckling under his slight weight. Palace records describe him lurching through rooms, clutching furniture, his walk a desperate shuffle. His spine, twisted into a severe curve, gave him the silhouette of an old man, though he was still young. Most chillingly, his body was deteriorating faster than age could explain, as if his very existence was a race against collapse. His mind was a maze of confusion, where thoughts flickered and died before taking root. His tutors, tasked with shaping a king, gave up in frustration. Teaching him to read was like teaching a shadow to speak. Letters danced before his eyes, refusing to form words. By 10, he could barely scrawl his name, and understanding remained elusive. Court documents offer glimpses of his lessons. Charles, hunched over a book, muttering syllables, only to forget them moments later. His emotions were chaotic. He could laugh at a jester one moment, then erupt into rages so fierce they terrified his attendants. Servants whispered of tantrums where he'd scream and thrash, overturning tables over a spilled cup. These gave way to silences. Hours where he sat motionless, staring at walls as if lost in a private world. His hair told a tale of decay, growing in thin, patchy clumps, falling out to reveal a scalp, mottled and raw. Court painters used wigs and shading to give him vitality, but in person, no illusions held. His skin was sallow, his eyes sunken, his breath labored. Doctors, armed with superstition and guesswork, were baffled. They prescribed tonics and bleedings, but nothing slowed his decline. Charles was a king, yet the Spanish Empire depended on him. His court was a hive of ambition, nobles scheming, foreign powers watching like vultures. Every decision, or lack thereof, mattered, and Charles, with his childlike mind and failing body, was at its center. Imagine the pressure. A man who could barely feed himself, navigating European politics. His mother, Queen Mariana, acted as regent early on, but even she couldn't shield him. Her letters reveal a woman torn between love and terror, describing her son as a fragile creature who might choke on his own tongue in sleep. She wasn't exaggerating. Charles' jaw and throat were so malformed that swallowing was a gamble. Royal dinners meant to showcase Spain's wealth became grotesque spectacles. Servants hovered, dabbing saliva as he struggled with pureed meals. Diplomats left with stories of pity and horror. One Venetian ambassador wrote, "His Majesty's presence is a trial for the senses, yet one cannot look away." Charles' speech, slurred and unintelligible, required interpreters not for language but for clarity. His proclamations meant to inspire were mumbled riddles, advisors guessing at his meaning. What must it have been like to live in that body, to feel a crown you couldn't comprehend? Surviving letters suggest moments where Charles mourned his limits. In one, written shakily, he asks, "Why am I thus made?" The question went unanswered by priests and doctors, who offered prayers and potions but no relief. The Habsburgs bore the blame. Their obsession with pure blood created a genetic catastrophe. Charles' parents shared so much DNA he was his own cousin several times over. Modern science would list his disorders: mandibular prognathism, scoliosis, intellectual disability, recessive diseases. But in the 17th century, there were only fear and superstition, and the growing belief that Charles was cursed. As his reign wore on, the whispers of witchcraft grew louder, and the court turned from medicine to mysticism, setting the stage for a descent into madness. The tragedy that defined Charles VI's reign was his inability to produce an heir, a failure not just personal but catastrophic, threatening to plunge Europe into chaos. The Spanish throne, the richest prize in the world, rested on a man whose body refused a king's most basic duty. Let's step into the royal bedchamber, where the stakes were intimate yet immense, and see how a dynasty's obsession led to its collapse. Charles married twice, each union a desperate bid to secure the Habsburg line. His first bride, Marie-Louise of Orleans, arrived with fanfare. Young and intelligent, she was raised on tales of grandeur. But meeting Charles shattered her dreams. In his 20s, he was hunched, drooling, his speech a garbled mess. The wedding night, whispered about in gossip, was a disaster. Servants said. Marie-Louise emerged in tears, Charles confused and distressed. Medical records reveal the truth. Charles was functionally impotent, his reproductive organs infantile. His genetic mutations left him with a child's sexual maturity in a failing body. The court couldn't admit this. To do so was to acknowledge the dynasty's flaw. Instead, they blamed Marie-Louise, subjecting her to humiliating examinations and foul herbal concoctions, fertility treatments that were torture. Physicians prescribed absurd rituals, amulets, prayers, animal organs. Marie-Louise withered under the pressure. Her smuggled letters revealed despair, begging for a miracle that never came. Some speculate the stress and toxic medicines led to her death at 26. Charles' second marriage, to Maria Anna of Neuburg, was more desperate. In his 30s, his health worse, Maria Anna, a pragmatic German princess, was tasked with producing an heir. Her letters describe a corpse-like man, so frail she feared he'd die during attempts at consummation. The court tried everything: doctors from Europe, ancient texts, magical remedies. Charles endured humiliating examinations, his genitals prodded as if they held Spain's future. Nothing worked. The problem was biological, the final nail in the Habsburg coffin. The lack of an heir was a geopolitical disaster. Spain's empire, with its colonies and wealth, was coveted. Without a successor, the throne was up for grabs, every court ready to fight. The War of Spanish Succession was brewing, ambassadors whispering of alliances and betrayals, while Charles struggled to survive. The irony is staggering. The Habsburgs controlled marriages to concentrate power, yet their final king couldn't consummate one. Charles was a paradox, a king whose existence threatened the empire he was meant to preserve. When medicine failed, the church stepped in, declaring Charles' condition demonic. Priests saw opportunity, and the court plunged into a surreal chapter, where exorcisms replaced governance, and a king became a pawn in a spiritual war. The Spanish court descended into a fevered madness as Charles VI's reign spiraled into the surreal. When science couldn't explain the king, the church intervened with crucifixes and holy water. Picture the throne room transformed into a stage for public exorcisms, where Spain's king writhed under zealots convinced he was possessed. This wasn't a sideshow. It was a desperate bid to save a dynasty, revealing the fear and superstition ruling Europe's most powerful court. The church's explanation was stark. Charles' deformities, infertility, and faltering mind were the work of evil spirits. Father Froilan Diaz, the chief exorcist, declared the king inhabited by multiple demons, placed by witches envious of Habsburg power. The solution was public exorcisms, not in a hidden chapel but in the palace's heart, with nobles and dignitaries as witnesses. Imagine Charles, frail and confused, on the throne room floor, convulsing as priests screamed Latin incantations. Diaz forced him to drink holy water mixed with relic fragments, bone and ash from saints' tombs, making Charles violently ill. Priests saw his vomiting and shaking as demons fighting back, but he was poisoned by filthy water and his weakened state. These ceremonies were theatrical, meant to awe and terrify. Priests pressed crucifixes against Charles' skin until he screamed, splashed holy water, and forced prayers he barely understood. Exorcisms lasted hours, leaving Charles exhausted. Sometimes he lost consciousness, too weak to endure. Diaz proclaimed he saw devils fleeing, naming each with flair. The court clung to these displays, even as Charles worsened. The exorcists went further, convinced the palace was cursed. In 1698, Diaz ordered a purification, a paranoid campaign. Servants scoured rooms, collecting items tainted by witchcraft. Queen's jewelry, foreign gifts, furniture. These were burned in courtyard bonfires, flames rising as priests chanted. Smoke drifted over Madrid, a sign of the court's madness. Heartbreakingly, Charles believed it worked. His limited mind was vulnerable, and when priests said demons were leaving, he felt fleeting relief. This created a cruel cycle. As symptoms worsened, he begged for more exorcisms, each draining him. In 1699, Diaz claimed to expel 47 demons, each with a name and purpose, some for his jaw, others for infertility. The ritual left Charles so weak he collapsed, silent for 3 days. This wasn't just superstition, it was a crisis symptom. The court, faced with an inexplicable king, blamed witches and devils rather than confront the truth. Charles's condition was from inbreeding. The exorcisms absolved the Habsburgs of their sins, a twisted denial of their obsession with power. As Charles' life neared its end, the rituals grew frantic, a desperate bid to save a king already slipping away, leading to a final reckoning no one could ignore. On November 1st, 1700, at 38, Charles II died, his body giving out after decades of suffering. His death ended a dynasty and sparked one of Europe's deadliest wars. Let's step into the autopsy room, where physicians uncovered a truth so shocking, it seemed to confirm every fear of curse and damnation. The autopsy, led by Dr. Geronimo de la Fuente Pirola, aimed to reveal what afflicted the king. The court had claimed he was bewitched, but now they needed truth. What they found was a body so ravaged it seemed impossible he lived so long. Pirola's report, initially suppressed, described a monster. Charles' heart was walnut-sized, shriveled and blackened, barely pumping blood. His lungs were corroded, filled with rotting tissue, the stench driving assistants away. His intestines were gangrenous, decaying inside him, his reproductive organs childlike. Most shocking was his brain, surrounded by fluid. Hydrocephalus, its tissue damaged, explaining his struggles. Pirola concluded, "It is a miracle this body sustained life, as it contained no healthy organ." The findings were so extreme, they reinforced supernatural fears. How could he survive unless dark forces were at play? The truth was horrifying. Charles was a genetic catastrophe from centuries of inbreeding, defect piled upon defect until his systems barely functioned. His 38 years were a battle against biology, a slow death in public. Charles' death left no heir, and Europe erupted. The War of Spanish Succession, long anticipated, killed hundreds of thousands and redrew the continent. The Habsburgs' obsession with purity destroyed their king and triggered a bloodbath. The Spanish throne passed to the Bourbons, ending Habsburg rule. But let's focus on Charles, the man behind the crown. He was no hero or villain, just a human born into an impossible role. His life was a tragedy, not of demons, but of human ambition unchecked. The Habsburgs thought they could bend nature. That power trumped biology. They were wrong, and Charles paid the price. As a historian, I'm drawn to stories like this for their raw truth. Power corrupts, but it also blinds. The Habsburgs didn't see the cliff they raced toward, and Charles fell. His story is a mirror, reflecting our obsessions with control and legacy. What are we sacrificing for greatness? What price will we pay? As we leave this haunted palace, carry Charles' story with you, not as a ghost tale, but a human one, a reminder that empires crumble from flaws within. If these dark corners of history grip you like they do me, hit that like button, subscribe for more hidden truths, and drop a comment. What forgotten story should we unearth next?